Yeah. Lani, did you want to say anything to begin with?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just give the background to my involvement with the project. So I am a co-owner of a building in downtown Kitimat, along with Andrea D'Souza. We have the building that has Vitality and the TSW Free Store and the Dupre and More candle and gift shop. And when we bought the building about 15 years ago, I think it was built in the early 60s. We started to do some renovations, and we were developing plans to try to do some green retrofits. We wanted to experiment with taking an older, energy inefficient building and seeing if we could use, upcycled and sustainable materials, and try to, in any of the renovations that we did, and try to get just the energy consumption down for the building. So it is a single pane building. And when we bought it, it did have a very oversized gas boiler, like a gas boiler that could heat. It's a pretty big building, 7,500 square feet roughly, but it had back in the day, they used to just oversize the heating system. So I guess maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we were running into problems where the boiler would fail. And it might be 2 or 3 days to get parts up to Kitimat, and that was an inconvenience for our tenants. So we started looking at fuel switching and wanting to go to an air-sourced heat pump. And we had previously looked into geothermal and were excited about that, but unfortunately, when they did the test drilling, it just wasn't the right conditions in that part of downtown Kitimat. So we did end up going with top of the line Dakin heat pump. It's rated to go down to like -30 without needing any backup heat. So we're quite pleased that we've managed to stop burning fossil fuels as a way to heat the building and switch from this gas boiler to the electricity. But then we recognize that we are also now creating a bigger draw off the grid. And we know that even though BC has a lot of hydropower, projects like Site C Dam, do have a big impact on communities, on agricultural land. They cost the taxpayer a lot of money. So for me, I really became interested in the idea of putting a solar array on the roof, so that now that we were not only doing this fuel switch, but that we might actually, over the course of a year, generate the power that we need to heat and cool the building, and that way, just feel that we're kind of doing our part to source our energy needs locally, in a sense, apart from obviously the inputs in the solar panels, but at least to not, in this fuel switch, be creating a bigger draw on the available hydro supply. So that's sort of my interest, and I just love the concept of community-owned amenities and co-ops in general, as opposed to a for-profit model. So I'm just really excited about the opportunity to partner with VREC and SolShare, and And I'm going to keep my camera off for your presentation, Rob, and then I'll come back on.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks.
So I guess I'll get started then. I'm Rob Baxter. I work with two companies, VREC Solar, which has been installing solar energy systems since 2004, so 20 years now. And then also SolShare Energy, which is a subsidiary of VREC, which owns and operates community-owned solar projects like this one that we might do in Kitimat. And we've been doing that for 10 years now. Whenever I do one of these presentations, I like to begin by asking why even do solar? Why should we be doing solar? And does it make sense here in BC? And usually, people raise objections based on our weather and our climate, especially on the coast. So I like to ask people if they know which country generates the largest percentage of its electricity from solar. If anyone wants to jump in and answer that, they can. I recently did ask this question at an event, and someone pointed out that the answer I was about to give was wrong, because there is a small island in the South Pacific, small island nation, that generates almost 100% of its electricity from solar.
Is it Denmark, Rob?
No,
Okay.
close though.
Is it the Netherlands?
No, also close.
I give up.
Geographically, anyway, it's Germany. So I think now China has the largest, as in terms of gross numbers, solar energy, but as a percentage, it's Germany. Has been Germany for quite a while. And the reason why I like to point that out is because in most of Germany, they would get similar or even less sunlight than you would get in Kitimat. So this chart here compares how much production you'd get from 1 nominal kilowatt of solar. So basically the same size system. As you can see, Kitimat's about the same as Frankfurt, Germany, a little bit better than Hanover, Germany. I have Tokyo in here because Japan used to be number 2 for solar energy. So the climate in Kitimat or Vancouver isn't ideal, but it's good enough, right? You know, like I said, Germany's generating the largest percentage of its electricity from solar compared to other countries. And yeah, most of Germany gets about the same as Kitimat. The other thing that people often bring up is the fact that the electricity supply in BC is already pretty green, right? Over 90% of the generation in BC comes from hydro. But there is still some fossil fuels on the grid, and we do import power from other places. It's getting better, especially since Alberta has shut down its coal-fired power plants. But when you take all of those things into consideration, even though the fact that the electricity on our grid is fairly green, installing solar actually does reduce greenhouse gas emissions, even if you account for all of the energy that goes into producing and transporting and installing the solar panels. It's still a little bit less than the energy on our grid. And that's the thing I used to emphasize. But nowadays, I think what's even more important is something that Lanny already raised, the fact that we need to electrify transportation and heating buildings here in British Columbia. So if we're going to meet our targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions, if we're going to prevent our children and future generations from having a world that's worse off than we have now, we need to electrify transportation and building heat. And when we say electrify transportation, people often think of EVs, but it's also things like electric bikes, electric buses. It'd be nice to have electric trains here in BC again, and even electric aircraft. So the photo of the electric aircraft here, this is actually a plane that Harbour Air has been flying for a few years now on test flights that's 100% electric. And here we have a house that's heated by heat pumps. This is actually in Fort St. John, so in the northern climate, but 100% of their heating is from electricity. So we need to do more of that, and we need more energy. There is some information out there about how much energy we need. Sometimes people think that we need more than we actually do. EVs are more efficient than gasoline cars. Heat pumps are more efficient than gas heating. So we don't need to get the same equivalent energy from electricity, but we are going to need more. And the question is, where will that come from? In the past, we've flooded valleys like the one shown in the background here to build dams. But even BC Hydro has realized that that's no longer makes sense. It's just too expensive to do that. So we're going to have to get our electricity from other sources. And solar is one of the best sources because you can install solar almost anywhere and generate electricity almost every day of the year. The only time you don't get electricity is when it's covered in snow. So we need more renewable energy. We need more solar energy. And when we look at how we're going to do that, I like to look at an island in Denmark, Samso Island. I don't know if either of you have heard of this island.
Yeah, I have a little bit. Maybe from you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's not well known for most people, but if you work in the energy transition world, it is fairly well known. In fact, I used to call it Samsu Island, and I learned how to pronounce it properly from a young Haida man when I was up on Haida Gwaii once. He gave a presentation because he had gone to Samso Island to study their energy transition because they wanted to duplicate it on Haida Gwaii. And this book that's in the photo here, I just happened to find it one day when I was looking for books for my kids in the Vancouver Library. It's a book about Samso Island. So this is an island in Denmark, and it used to import 100% of its electricity. And a lot of that electricity was from fossil fuels. I think even a lot of it was coal. But today, Samso generates 100% of its own electricity. In fact, it produces excess electricity. It exports electricity to other parts of Denmark and Europe, and it's 100% renewable. So a lot of people talk about this place as an example of the energy transition that we all need to do, but they often leave out a really important part. How this started was they installed a large wind farm that was not owned by the local utility. It wasn't owned by the government. It wasn't owned by some big corporation in Copenhagen. It was owned by the people on Samso. So the farmers, the teachers, the small business people. There's a lot of farmland on this island and some small industry, but mostly just small scale stuff. They got together, they formed a cooperative, and they bought this, put together this wind farm. And this isn't unusual in Denmark. 100,000 people belong to community-owned energy co-ops in Denmark, and in Europe, over 1.2 million people belong to energy co-ops. So this is the model that inspired us, and what we're trying to do with SolShare. Now, we do things a little bit differently than they did in Denmark, where they could sell the electricity straight onto the grid. We couldn't do that here in BC, at least when we started 10 years ago, we couldn't. So we actually sell electricity to buildings or building owners. So what we do is we get together a community of investors, like we might do here in Kitimat. They pool their money together, and SolShare uses that to install a solar energy system on the building. So SolShare doesn't actually install it themselves. VREC, our parent company, or another solar installer might do the installation, but SolShare owns it. So they buy the system from that installer. That system then feeds the host building electricity, and the host building pays for the electricity that's generated, and then SolShare takes that money and returns a portion of it to the investors in the form of dividends. The host building is still connected to the grid, like in this case it would be BC Hydro. If the solar is not generating enough electricity, they get money from BC Hydro. If they generate excess electricity, they can actually sell that back to BC Hydro and get a credit through the net metering program, or as it's now called, the self-generation program. So that's the base of how the model works for SolShare. Here's an example of how the billing would work for the building owner. So before they do the, it's called a power purchase agreement, a PPA, with SolShare, they would be paying BC Hydro for their electricity. Afterwards, they're now getting two bills, one from BC Hydro and one from SolShare for the PPA, but the total of the two should be less than what it was before. So they save a little bit of money. This is just some more information for the building owner. A little bit about investing in SolShare. So it's open to any resident of Canada, but we try to give priority to the local community. The idea is that we are building projects in communities that people in those communities can jointly own. We are subject to the BC Security Commission rules. So there's pretty strict rules about what we can do. We use something called an offering memorandum exemption if you want to look at the technicalities of how that works. We could also use a crowdfunding exemption, but we haven't used that yet. We've mostly just used this offering memorandum exemption. And we also offer Indigenous ownership. So any projects going forward, we usually try to contact the local First Nation and offer them shares in the project. We gift a small amount of shares, but then they also have priority if they want to purchase additional shares in the project. The investment, so if you decide to invest in the project, you are actually becoming an owner of the project. So it's different than some other renewable energy investments where you actually buy a bond, you're lending money to the company, and then there's a term and you get the money back at the end of the term. In this case, you actually own a share in the project, and there is no term, so you don't automatically get your money back at a certain point. It's a $500 minimum investment. going forward. In the past, we had a higher limit, but we've been lowering that. Like I said, we have a 10-year track record. We've been doing this for 10 years, and we've paid out dividends at least once every year. So paying out dividends is not something that's theoretical. It's something we've been doing every year. And the most recent dividend we paid out was 4.75%. On your taxes, you do get a dividend tax credit for that. So if you're comparing it to something like a savings account where you have to pay full taxes, it's more like 5%. And we hope to raise that dividend rate in the future. So if we do a project this year, we could probably increase that to 5% and then potentially in the future raise it to 6 or 7% based on how many projects we do. When you initially buy in, you're supporting a project that's taking place at that time. So like in this case, it would be the local project in Kitimat. But then the revenue from all of the projects that we've done get pooled together and the dividends get paid out from those. So what that means is it's a more diversified portfolio, right? So if one project isn't performing as well, it's less of an impact because we're looking at the revenues from all the projects. So like I said, it's not a term investment, so you don't automatically get the money you've invested back at a certain point, but you can sell the shares to another investor. It's not a publicly traded company, so you can't just call up a broker and do that. But right now we have a waiting list of people who want to buy shares. So if someone decides they want to sell shares, we can probably find someone to buy them for them. And in the future, we'll also look at doing share buybacks where we'll give people the option of selling the shares back to SolShare. So that's another possibility for selling the shares if you decide you wanted your money back. It is a long-term investment. So when we sell power to building owners, we do it through 10-year contracts. And the way it's set up is that the rate that they're paying for the electricity increases annually, but only half as much as BC Hydro rates increase. So over time, they're actually paying less and less compared to BC Hydro. So at the end of 10 years, they have the option of renewing, and it's most likely that they will because they're paying even less for electricity now. Most of the equipment that we install and that you become an owner of has 25 to 30-year warranties. So again, it's a long-term investment. Also, a part of the revenues that we get from selling electricity, we set aside as reserves so that when the equipment finally does fail after 25 or 30 years, we have money to replace it. So our business plan actually goes out 140 years, even though that's highly speculative. It's based on the principle of 7 generations, which we've learned from Indigenous people. So the idea of each generation being 20 years, 7 is about 140 years. So we actually plan that far in the future, just making sure we have enough cash flow to keep the company going. Just a little bit of our history. Like I mentioned, the parent company VREC has been around since 2004. In 2005, we were the first contractor to install a grid tie system in BC. In 2014, we applied to the BC Utilities Commission for an exemption that would allow us to sell electricity to buildings. So we actually became a utility, but we're exempt from some of the rules that the large utilities have to follow. In 2016, we did our first public offering of shares and our first power plant came online. In 2018, we did a second offering for a second power plant and a third one in 2022. This next slide shows a photo of the second plant that we did, which was actually similar to the first one. They were both on multi-unit residential buildings in Vancouver. The third project we did was on a vineyard in Kelowna, Tantalus Vineyard. So there's a photo of that system. So we're selling the electricity to the vineyard operations there. And then the next project could be one in Kitimat. Lanny's already talked about the building that's in downtown Kitimat. This would be a 50 kilowatt system. If we decide to go ahead, we'd probably install it sometime in the spring or summer. The system cost would be about $136,000. Although when I was putting the slide together, I thought that price seemed a bit high. I think maybe we could do it for a little bit less than that. just with some design changes and some price changes that have happened recently. And then the capital required would be about $77,000. Now, that seems strange, right? It costs 136, but we only need to raise 77,000. And that's because there's a couple of really good rebates that are available right now for these types of solar energy systems, both from the federal government and from BC Hydro. So that reduces the cost by about half, which is good for us. And of course, good for the building owner too, because we can offer them better rates. So yeah, that's how much money we would need to raise. If we were going to do that totally locally in Kitimat, that would be about, we need 77 people to give us $1,000, or if we use the minimum amount, 500, of course, it would be more like 140. But we do have people, like I said, on a waiting list from all over BC, so we wouldn't have to get 100% of that from Kitimat. We just like to get as much as we could from local people. Yeah, and that is pretty well the end of my presentation, so we should have time for any questions people have now. Any questions?
Rob, I had a question, but I feel like I need you to back up the slides to remind me of what it was. It was about 3 slides back. Let's see, I'll tell you, it was before that. Before that, shoot. Maybe it was there. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm gonna let Michelle go because I can't think of what it was. I think it had something to do with the selling back, maybe.
Oh, the share buyback? Was that was back?
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about for folks. So say they have $500 they want to put in there. So so you're getting on $500, you're getting $25 a year dividend. It's not, you're doing it more of a feel good thing. So you get say paid your dividends, and then 5 years in, you're like, oh, I really want that money. You would then ask to sell it, and presumably you have someone on the waiting list, and you would just get that $500 principal paid back to you, or does the value change?
Yeah, the way it's set up, the share value doesn't change, so you would just get that money back.
Okay, and so that reminds me of my other question. So what I find really interesting though is you're saying that if I invest $500 at age 40, the idea is that at age 80 I'm still getting my 4 or 5 or 6 or 7% dividend, because you're paying the dividends out to people only after you've set aside what you need for that 7-generation resiliency and sustainability. So that dividend is actually after the end of life cycle of these projects should go on in perpetuity.
Yeah.
So even if you think of you're getting a 5% back, that means it's going to take 20 years to earn your investment back at 5% per year, but that can just keep on carrying on as and presumably you could gift your shares to your children in your estate and all of that.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
And then if we're interested in this, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask if there's any other questions.
No, yeah, sorry. And if we're interested in investing, we contact you, Rob, or?
Yeah, the best thing to do is if you go to the website, which is solshare.ca, solshare.ca, there's a contact us form, and you fill out that form, and then that puts you on the mailing list, email list.
Okay.
We don't send out emails very often, like maybe once or twice a year, except if we have a new project happening, and then the emails are a bit more frequent. But so if we decide to go ahead with the project in Kitimat, you'll get an email saying, this is the what you have to do to join the investment. So there's some paperwork to fill out. And the way the rules work with the BC Security Commission, there's a very limited time period that we have to do this in. So all of that information will be in that email.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Rob, I have to say, I'm really glad that you dropped it from 1,000 to 500. I had in my mind, I knew that you had investors from outside Kitimat that might be interested. So I sort of had in my mind 50,000 as a nice target. That if we could get 50 people to invest $1,000, but I think it might be easier to get 100 people to invest $500. So yeah, thank you. So I was wondering if maybe this would be a good time to wrap up the recording and then maybe have a bit more of an informal conversation with Michelle and not be too worried about, that everything we're saying is going to be distributed to people we don't know.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so yeah, thanks, and I'll stop the recording now.